Every vote counts, or does it? A look at the mathematics behind determining winners of elections. Professor Thomas Hartfield.
It seems appropriate every couple of years to do this presentation because we go through a major election cycle. And certainly this is not focused on political science or on government or anything of that nature. But there is a mathematical component in determining how who wins an election and how an election is counted. Okay. To motivate this, I give an election every couple of years when I do this presentation involving ice cream. So let's look at our candidates. Okay, the candidates are butter pecan and chocolate, chocolate chip and coffee, cookies and cream and dark chocolate, French vanilla and mint chocolate chip, Rocky Road and strawberry, vanilla and vanilla fudge ripple. Now these are traditionally the top 12 flavors of ice cream by sales across the ice cream industry. There is an industry tracking, and these 12 usually come to the top. Occasionally you'll see a few other flavors sneak in, but these are the main ones. To kind of imitate the idea of political systems, I've divided them up somewhat arbitrarily, but not entirely so, into parties. We have the vanilla party, cookies and cream, French vanilla, and vanilla fudge ripple. We have the chocolate party, chocolate, chocolate chip, dark chocolate, mint chocolate chip, and Rocky Road. These are good parallels to the ideas that within a party you have sort of your pure candidates, the vanilla, the chocolate themselves, your extremists, like dark chocolate or French vanilla. You have your middle-of-the-road candidates like cookies and cream and chocolate chip. And then you have the ones that are just kind of out there like mint chocolate chip that some people really like, but maybe not representative otherwise. And then, of course, there's the independents, who are essentially a collection of fruits and nuts, which we have those in the political system too. Okay? Now, the question becomes, if only one of these could be served, who would make the most people happy? What would be the best representative of the ice cream election? Okay? So let's do some connection between this and what's going on. Of course, this is a major presidential year. Also, there are congressional races. Every House of Representatives seat is up for election this year. A third of the Senate races are up. So, you know, there's a logic to connecting or to talking about elections. Who wins is important, both on a personal level. I want someone to represent me, or you want someone to represent you. And of course, it's also important on a systemic level. We want our political systems to be determined by, you know, some logical state of control. It's important, and these are both small d, small r. Democratic and Republican systems require free and fair elections. Okay, how you count the votes is a relevant discussion, but I don't want to use actual candidates because that quickly devolves into something that's not productive. Ice cream is a good analogy. Okay, so now we're going to talk about election systems and some aspects about them from a mathematical point of view. Some things to kind of tailor our approach. We're going to be focusing only on single winner systems. There are a lot of different ways of choosing candidates based on the number of winners and how you want to choose the winners. For instance, there are some elections where you'll have multiple direct winners. An example of this is that in Australia, each election cycle, each state elects 3 senators at one time. And so how do you choose that? That's a relevant question, but it's not the focus of where we're at. And then proportional representation, some elected bodies, instead of choosing individual members from a district, choose to take the collective vote as a whole and divide them up between candidates or parties and maybe have 80 representatives that are divided up by percentages. Again, that's not the focus of this talk. We're going to look at the major election systems. These are the ones that are the most commonly discussed, with one exception, and I'll get to that in a second. There's plurality, which is also called first past the post. Plurality plus runoff, with or without party primaries. Instant runoff, or sometimes called single transferable vote. Board account and approval. Okay. in order to demonstrate how these work, I had to have sort of a feasibility. So there were three major ways that I conducted the ballots with my students in my classes. I looked at party primaries, I looked at a ranked ballot, and I looked at an overall approval. Okay? These are the paper ballots I've used in the past, but this year, as seems appropriate in this day and age, I have changed over to electronic voting. And of course, I can't speak to whether that was rigged or not, and that's a possible divergent concern, but that the primary vote was done through online websites. Okay? All right, getting to the point on counting the votes. Okay? What is voting? What is voting? Voting is a formal, official way of collectively communicating who wants to lead us. Okay? We have to have a way of determining who's going to win. Okay? And so we need to look at the metrics on how each system determines its winner, because there are strengths and weaknesses. In voting theory and elections theory, there is mathematically no single system that satisfies every possible desire. You have to still choose what's most important to you. Okay? There are a bunch of criteria that can be considered in determining whether a system should be used. Here are 6 of them, but there are more. The majority criterion is that you want the candidate who is rated the highest by the majority of voters to always win. You would think that would always work. That doesn't. There are some systems that doesn't work. The monotonic criterion, if you have somebody ranked above somebody else, can they lose because you voted for somebody higher than somebody else? That would seem to be a problem if you choose one candidate to do better than another, but because of that, they actually don't win. The consistency and participation criteria. Consistency is that if you take 2 groups and you have the 2 groups independently vote, will you always get the same result? And participation. Participation is a very relevant one in like this election cycle. Is it better to vote than to not vote? And in some systems, sometimes it's in your benefit to actually not vote. Now, the one major method I don't talk about of the ones I'm going to show you is what's called Condorcet voting. And Condorcet voting is where you pairwise compare every pair of candidates. And this is extremely time-consuming, particularly with a large number of candidates, because mathematically this becomes, let's see, with 12 candidates, it turns out there's 78 comparisons, because it's the sum of all the numbers less than the number of candidates. So if you have 12 candidates, it's the sum of 1 through 11 number of comparisons you have to do. So, but you can talk about with respect to Condorcet principles, the winner and loser criteria. Condorcet winner says that the one that would head-to-head win the most often should win overall. And the Condorcet loser criteria is that if you always lose a competition, you shouldn't win. Or you lose more often, you shouldn't be the overall winner. And then the clone independence, that's sort of related to consistency. There are some other criteria. Arrows and possibility theorem is an actual mathematical theorem. I'm not going to try to prove this, but actually shows that you cannot satisfy all the criteria. Okay? A big point of order with any system is whether it encourages sincere or strategic voting, and sometimes strategic voting is called tactical voting. The idea that if I can't have this person win, I'm going to find a way for somebody else to lose. And most of the time, this is considered to be a negative. You should want somebody to win. It shouldn't be a question of trying to encourage the person you don't want to win to lose. It should be a matter of, can you make the one you want win? This is a very big deal, and there are certain systems that are extremely sensitive to tactical voting. Okay? So let's go through the methods. Okay? And this is data done from either 2 rounds of voting in my classes this semester, either with the electronic, or I did some runoffs by paper ballot as well. Let's talk about plurality voting, which is also called first past the post. Voters mark off their first preference only. The total number of first preferences of each candidate is added up. The winner is the one receiving the most first preferences. Okay, very simple. Okay. Now, the more candidates you have, the more splitting of the vote you're usually going to have. So parties typically want to whittle down the number of candidates that they send to the election. For the sake of convenience, I've assumed that the purest candidates will win the parties, vanilla and chocolate. And so on this first ballot here, we're going to look at the three independents, butter pecan, coffee, and strawberry, going up against the pure party winners, chocolate and vanilla. And amongst 74 voters, chocolate wins. So let's congratulate chocolate for being our first winner. Now, an obvious problem with this is 74 voters, 20 voted for it. That's kind of a weak, kind of majority. It's not a majority, it's even a weak plurality. A little bit of math there, that's not even 30% of these 5 candidates. Only less than 30% voted for chocolate. So you've got some real questions. Is chocolate the one that most people would be happiest with? Okay. Look how bad it could be if you had all 12 candidates. If you had all 12 candidates, chocolate still wins, but it wins with all of 11 of 74 votes, or about 15%. Okay? Now, as crazy as it sounds, if I go back up here for a moment, that you have a majority of candidates and you have a winner with such a low percentage, this actually happens in countries and in locations that use this kind of voting. Okay. Where is it used? Amongst other places, it's used for Canada and the United Kingdom for national parliamentary elections. Some things about this, it is easy to understand and implement. I mean, in terms of ease to understand, which is important, you don't want people confused, it's very easy. But there's no guarantee the winner has the strength of a large portion of the electorate. Very sensitive to multiple forms of strategic voting. Again, if you know your candidate's not going to win, you end up not voting for who you want to win. You end up voting for somebody else with the hope that somebody you don't want to win doesn't win. Duverger's law is the idea that usually plurality systems lead to two-party systems. Ironically, although there's a lot of evidence that that's the case, in Canada and the United Kingdom, that doesn't actually happen right now. That's a problem, too. And then finally, it satisfies the philosophy of one person, one vote. In the United States, this is considered to be a very big thing. Each person should get one vote. With all due respect to the cliche, vote early and often, we're not supposed to do that in the United States. Okay? And it's very clear, each person's getting one vote. Okay? Amongst the criteria that are satisfied, clearly majority and monotonic are going to have to be satisfied because of the fact majority, it's whoever has the most votes wins. And monotonic, there is no chance voting for somebody else is going to encourage the candidate you vote for to not finish higher. Consistency and participation are satisfied. But there is no guarantee. In fact, a lot of times the Condorcet comparisons don't win, like head-to-head. It's possible for the one who wins on a plurality to be the least favored in a head-to-head set of elections. All right, so let's show an interesting example of this. In 2004, in the Canadian federal elections, the Conservative Party won 13 of the 14 districts, are called ridings in Canada, in the province of Saskatchewan. Yet, out of winning almost more than 90% of the districts in the province, they only won 43% of the vote. Furthermore, in one of the ridings, Saskatoon-Humboldt, the Conservative Party candidate won with 26.7% of the vote. About what our chocolate ice cream candidate won with. Because there were 4 major candidates, and they almost split the vote amongst them in quarters. Does the person that got 26.7% of the vote really represent the district? Are they the one that is the most in line with the people of their district? And so this is an issue. This is a concern. All right, now let's get to what's a little more familiar to us in the United States, and that is plurality plus runoff voting. Okay, voters mark their first preference. First preferences are added up. If there's a majority on the original ballot, then that person or that candidate wins. If not, you go to a second round of voting with the top 2 candidates. This is what we do in most elections in the United States. Okay. All right, so we had our party primary voting. The vanilla party. Turned out that cookies and cream inched by French vanilla. So the sort of centrist candidate here, the one that combines a little vanilla and a little chocolate, beat the real hardcore vanilla party member. Okay. Over on the chocolate side, chocolate went into a runoff with mint chocolate chip. Now, I don't think most people would doubt that chocolate is going to head-to-head beat mint chocolate chip. There are people that like that flavor, but they're not going to be in the majority of any group probably. Okay? So you'll notice here that it quickly became a landslide in the runoff. And here's sort of the issue we run in the United States. We've already had to have 2 rounds of voting here. We've had to have the party primaries and the party runoffs. Now we advance to the general election. Since we have 5 candidates here, we now have the possibility that nobody gets a majority. Cookies and cream gets a plurality here amongst these 5, and then a voting against these 5. But it turns out they don't win all that decisively against, of all candidates, Butter Pecan in the runoff. I'm not exactly sure how Butter Pecan got that much support. This is an anomaly. But this was a third-party year for the ice cream election, and you'll see that in a moment. So, ultimately here, let us congratulate Cookies and Cream being our second winner. Yes, yay. Okay, so notice now 2 different systems, 2 different winners. Where is it used? Pretty much almost universally in the United States. A lot of countries, by the way, that have a true presidential election have some form of a plurality plus runoff voting system. Again, easy to understand. It has some guarantee that the winner has the strength of a portion of the electorate, because at least they would at some point was majority. But it is very sensitive, again, to strategic voting. If you know your candidate can't win, sometimes you'll make sure that the second place person gets in, so that you hope that in a runoff, they'll actually win out. Again, Duverger's law kicks in, and it's unquestionable here in the United States. We have a 2-party system, and it's almost impossible to have a productive, consistent third party in the United States. If you look throughout American history, anytime a new party has ever gotten foothold, an old party has gone away. The most recent of that was when the Republicans took over for the Whigs back around the Civil War. But there used to be the Democrats and the Whigs prior to about 1860. When the Republicans went into their ascendancy, the Whigs went away, and we kept a 2-party system. It does still satisfy the philosophy of 1 person, 1 vote. It satisfies the same criteria as plurality. But you end up with sort of some interesting scenarios happening with this method. 2002 French presidential elections. With an abundance of candidates running, no majority was reached on the first ballot. It almost never happens in the French election because they usually have anywhere from 6 to 12 candidates. While polls indicated the strongest support for the center-right Republican Party and the center-left Socialist Party, the 2 top candidates ended up being from the Republican Party and from the extremist National Front Party. A guy by the name of Jean Le Pen, and his daughter is still active in politics over there, a woman by the name of Marie Le Pen. Jean Le Pen was somewhat of I don't want to say a Nazi sympathizer, but she was certainly sympathetic to sort of anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant, radical anti-immigrant policies. And so on the second ballot, the incumbent president at the time, Jacques Chirac, ended up winning with an 85% majority. Because whether people really liked Jacques Chirac or not, they weren't going to vote for Le Pen in the runoff. Now, there is a variation on this that is actually used in some jurisdictions of the United States called blanket primaries or jungle primaries. Louisiana has been doing this for years. I have family from Louisiana. It's just a weird state. But California, which is growing very weird in its own right, decided very recently to go to this system as well. In order to kind of cut down on the iterations, because you can have the possibility of 4 iterations with a runoff system, because we have 2 in the party primaries and then 2 in the general election. They abolished having party primaries. Everybody runs in 1 primary election. Okay? And in that scenario, you end up just taking the top 2 candidates regardless of party. Sometimes they're from the same party. That can happen. But you take the top 2 candidates regardless of party and you send them to a runoff if necessary, if nobody gets a majority up front. Okay? So if we go back to our original primary here, the the plurality of all 12, you'll notice that chocolate and strawberry make it to the finish line here. And in that race head-to-head, chocolate wins easily over strawberry. I'm not going to bring out another chocolate because this is not counting as a completely different, separate method. But nonetheless, notice that this method did not produce the same winner that the other plurality runoff did. Interesting election example, and one very close to my heart because my grandmother lived in Louisiana at the time of this, and I can remember this very clearly. I was 15 at the time. In Louisiana in 1991, there were a lot of candidates on the ballot. The three primary candidates was the incumbent Republican Buddy Roemer, who was originally a Democrat and switched over, the former Democratic Governor Eddie Edwards, and the nominally Republican candidate David Duke. In the jungle primary, it turned out that Roemer only got 27% of the vote and was slightly topped by Edwards and Duke. Why was this significant? Well, Edwards had already been indicted while governor, he was not convicted, of bribery as governor. And he had a history of scandals, both political and of the personal nature. David Duke was a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Wow. And still had ties to neo-Nazi groups. The National Association of the Advancement of White People. Yes, there really is such a thing. I'm not endorsing it in any way, but that was affiliated with it. So what you had here was a runoff between two extremely unsavory characters to a lot of people. And I can remember my grandmother holding her nose as much as she despised Edwards, voting for him because she was not going to vote for David Duke. And in the runoff, Edwards won handily, 61% of the vote. But it should be noted that 7 years later, Edwin Edwards would be convicted on 17 federal counts of racketeering and extortion while in office.
What happens if you don't vote? What happens if everybody decided not to vote?
I don't think there's any situation where that actually happens. I mean, if one person votes, then they have the one vote. I mean, I don't think there's any scenario where in a large-scale environment you have everybody abstain.
You never know.
Well, you do see it occasionally where people boycott things, but what ends up happening is that you have a weak winner that doesn't necessarily have the endorsement of the whole group at large, but you have a winner nonetheless. All right, third method, the instant runoff voting, or also called single transferable vote. This is a system where people rank their preferences, and some systems require all the candidates to be ranked, others just require maybe the top three. The total number of first preferences is added up, and if somebody gets a majority, they win. But if they don't, and this is where the math kicks in really hard, the candidates with the lowest number of voters are eliminated, and their preferences are transferred to whoever was the next ranked candidate on their ballot. So let's say you ranked, just as an example, you ranked dark chocolate first and then chocolate second, and dark chocolate gets eliminated, your vote gets switched to chocolate. Seems like a pretty good way of indicating who you really want, because at any point when your candidate is knocked out, somebody you still like is at the very top of the list. Does that make sense? All right, this process continues until either a candidate reaches a majority or all the candidates are eliminated. The problem that comes in with this is the fact that this is not always a quick, simple, easy process. Follow me here. We have 12 candidates. The lowest two were dark chocolate and French vanilla. They were eliminated. Dark chocolate threw its votes to coffee and cookies and cream. French vanilla transferred its to cookies and cream and Rocky Road. So here's our new totals. All right, nobody has a majority still. So this time we eliminate coffee because they have the next lowest total. The four people, that would be the three people for coffee and the one that was transferred, I believe it was from French vanilla, their four preferences get transferred to others: butter pecan, chocolate chip, and Rocky Road. New count here. This is going to continue for a while. Okay, you'll notice now vanilla and French vanilla have the lowest numbers, so they're eliminated. Their votes are transferred, and now we get to this. Now it's chocolate chip and Rocky Road at the bottom. They get eliminated, and their votes get transferred. Mint chocolate chip goes away. Transfer, butter pecan goes away. You can see that this can take a while. Butter pecan transfers. By the way, we have 74 votes here, so we're looking for at least 38 for one of the candidates. That would be more than half. Here at this point, we don't quite have that. You'll notice it's very close. Strawberry is the low man on the three-man totem pole here. So what happens then is Strawberry gets knocked out, and it turns out that Chocolate ekes out a one-vote winner over Chocolate Chip. Thus, our third election winner is once again Chocolate. Yay! We have two now things of chocolate. All right, so let's consider some issues. All right, first off, where is this used? It's used in Australian House races, Irish presidential elections, and a few municipalities in the United States, San Francisco being one of the major ones, use this for their city races. It's easy to understand in principle, but you can see it can be very difficult to understand in practice if you don't see it laid out. No idea that somebody's removed, their votes are transferred, and this happens over and over again. It's an example mathematically of an iterative process. The minimum votes, eliminated, transferred, repeat until you get a majority. Large numbers of candidates require a large amount of data to gather and process. And the more data you have issues of losing it or it being manipulated. Can require a lot of time to compute the results. Total time, though, is less than plurality, because here's the bottom line. The advantage over doing a plurality plus runoff system is that you're not having to do two sets of votes. And an election can cost millions of dollars to hold. Okay? And there is some uncertainty over whether it satisfies the philosophy of one person, one vote, because you're marking on the ballot 12 choices, and when your first one gets eliminated, you go to a second one. So are you, in a sense, voting twice or more often? By the way, there is a U.S. requirement in federal elections that in federal elections, they must satisfy the one person, one vote criteria. It is less sensitive to strategic voting, but it does increase the relevance of the lower tiered candidates because you have to often rank all of them. There is a guarantee of some level that the electorate is happy. But, and this is a very big deal here, the order of who is eliminated can impact who wins. I have to admit something. When I was tallying these votes, I made a careless error. And because of who I eliminated, because I eliminated chocolate chip instead of coffee at a particular stage, I had the columns flip-flopped around a little bit, I ended up having Strawberry win because who moved around. Remember that three-way tie was very close? There were enough votes shifted that eliminated Chocolate instead of Strawberry at that point, and therefore Chocolate threw to Strawberry and ended up Strawberry winning the election instead of Chocolate. So it's very significant who gets elected or who gets eliminated win. And that's not a good thing. It does satisfy some criteria. Majority is happy. Condorcet loser, the one that always is lowest, should not win. But Condorcet winner and monotonic are not satisfied. And here's the problem. Who you put in a rank order affects who gets eliminated. So if you have somebody that could be eliminated early on, it's a bad thing that they get eliminated early on and then your vote gets to somewhere that maybe otherwise it wouldn't go to. Interesting election example of this, 2010 Australian federal election, Tasmanian electorate of Denson. There were 4 candidates who got almost all the votes. An independent candidate only had 21% of the first preferences. Okay, he finished third. But when the people were appropriately eliminated, he ended up winning the seat with 51% of the final head-to-head majority. And this unseated a Labor Party candidate who had been in office for 23 years. And so the question is, if he was only the first preference of 21% of the people, should he really have been the one that won, knocking out an entrenched incumbent? There is a question on that. All right, fourth counting method. Got about 10 more minutes. Board account. Board account is a ranking system, but instead of having the ranking done first to 12th or whatever the number is, you go the other way around. The top candidate gets the most points, the bottom candidate gets the least, and what you end up doing is you add up the number of points. Okay, so each candidate gets one less here than the one above it, the least gets 1 point, and you add up the points, and whoever has the most number of points wins. Here, Very surprising result. Strawberry wins. It's extremely close. Look at strawberry versus chocolate chip
Wait, didn't you eliminate strawberries?
on a different system.
Oh.
But this is a different system. So here we have, I am proud to announce, strawberry is our winner. A few people happy about strawberries. Yes, now this is the first time in 5 times of doing this that I've had strawberry win on any system. So this is like, as I mentioned before, appears to be like a third party here. Okay? Now, some observations on when it's used. There are a few countries that use board account. Slovenia in Europe uses a form of board account for their national elections. There are some small South Pacific nations that also use it. We're going to talk about an example involving Nauru. Most people in here that might be familiar with the idea, even if not the name, are familiar with it because this is how rankings in college sports are determined. And there are other private competitions that sometimes do this kind of system of counting. Okay? It's easy to understand. It does require some data, but the compilation of the data is simple. The time is pretty little. It doesn't take long to do. But I say uncertainty over whether it satisfies the philosophy of one person, one vote. I would say actually probably it's best to say it doesn't satisfy one person, one vote. You're clearly voting for all the candidates. Okay? While less sensitive to strategic voting, it is more sensitive to strategic nominating, with advantages coming when there are similar candidates nominated. The idea here, if you put a lot of similar candidates together, you'll all rank them high, and it allows you to take a different candidate who might otherwise have been the second best. If there's a bunch of similar candidates there, now they're fifth best and they get a lot less points. Ranking of less preferred candidates becomes very important, and sometimes that shouldn't happen. You shouldn't really care just as much about who's at the bottom as who's at the top. So it does satisfy some of these. Monotonic, consistent participation, and Congress a loser, but not all of them. There are some variations on the board account, okay, that you don't rank all the candidates. Variation A, the first preferred candidate gets the number of points equal to the number of candidates on the ballot. So, for instance, if you want to have only 10 of the 12 voted or ranked, then the top candidate gets 10 and down to 1 for the last one you vote, and anybody you don't vote for gets a 0. Variation B chooses some number of people that are going to be ranked, but everybody has to rank the same number, okay, so that the first preference always gets the maximum number of points. C, you affix some other lower number, and let's say the top 3, and you divide up the points in such a way where the top vote getter gets a significantly better result out of the point total. And then variation D, which is very interesting here, instead of giving points, you actually give fractions. The top candidate gets 1 point, the second one gets 1/2, the third one gets 1/3, and doesn't that sound like an arithmetic joy to do? Because you're going to have, let's say, 5 or 6 candidates, you're going to have people with fractions of 1/4 and 1/5 that you're adding up together amongst all these halves and thirds and ones and all. Kind of get an interesting set of numbers. Where do you see these? College football, option B. Prior to the invention of the Bowl Championship Series, the method for who was the national champion was done by the board account. Still the way they do rankings now. Who's the number 1 team right now? It's the University of Alabama. On the votes, they vote the top 25 teams. The number 1 team gets 25 points, down to 1 point for the 25th place team. They add up the points, and whoever has the most points is the number 1 team. So this is very familiar to a lot of people, even if they've never heard the name. Now, interesting, option C is used by the Heisman Trust to determine who gets the Heisman Trophy. They take the top 3, and then they have a system for determining who is using that to determine who's the best college football player. And then I mentioned Nauru a moment ago. They use option D with their presidential elections. This option favors those candidates with more first preferences because of the fact that it guarantees that the first place person gets twice as much credit than the second, 3 times as much credit as the third, 4 times the fourth, and so on. Because that's what's happening with this practice. By taking those reciprocals, second place gets a half, third place gets a third, fourth place gets a fourth, you ensure that the top candidate gets a multiple effect compared to the other candidates. Okay? And the last method, the approval voting method. Voters mark all the acceptable candidates, and whoever has the marks of the most total marks is the winner. Okay? So here, this is not a case of how people rank them, just if they like them or not. And in this particular scenario, congratulations to Cookies and Cream winning again. Out of the 74 people voting, 55 said they would eat it. So congratulations, Cookies and Cream, one more time. Okay. Now, a couple of observations here. Notice how vanilla, which was never a factor in any other system, is pretty high with an approval. And we all know this because, if there's only one flavor of ice cream, a lot of times it's going to be vanilla because if nobody really loves it, few people really hate it. And so, there's a strong tendency towards something like vanilla being able to finish high because of the fact that a lot of people have a positive feeling about it. On the other hand, the outliers, the extremists, ones like dark chocolate and vanilla fudge ripple and mint chocolate chip, end up getting a much significantly lower proportion of the votes. Nobody's currently using approval voting in national or government elections. But the Mathematical Association of America actually does use it when they determine their chairperson. And there are other national organizations that do it. And a variation on approval voting was actually used in 2010 for the selection of the new mascot at the University of Mississippi. And I'll just make the side note with the recent election we had for the mascot of the University of North Georgia. It'd be interesting to see if we'd have had the same results with approval voting that we would have with basically we used a first past the post system. You mark your first candidate, and whoever had the greatest percentage won. Turned out to be a majority, but how did they use, I'm sorry, not there yet. Issues, very easy to understand and implement. It's very cheap to do, but it does not satisfy one person, one vote, so it could not be used under current law as a federal system. It is the most likely to encourage sincere voting because there is absolutely no advantage to not voting for somebody you like, and there's absolutely no advantage to voting for someone you don't. There's none. And one of the advantages to approval voting is that it does seem to take you towards centrist candidates and away from extremes. Because whoever has sort of a common overlap of being satisfying everybody typically is the one in the middle politically. But this sometimes elects candidates with relatively weak support, ones that are satisfactory but not really anybody really loves. And when you need a leader, that may not be the best option. Because if they're not really well liked by anybody, they don't have the ability to lead in that environment. It does satisfy monotonic consistency of participation, does not satisfy the count or save principles, and it's ambiguous about majority and independence claim. So talk about the Ole Miss example from 2010. They were replacing their previous mascot, which was Colonel Reb, a sort of figurehead from the segregationist era. They gave them 3 final candidates. One of these is really silly looking. At least one. Anyway, these were their 3 final candidates. Okay? And so they didn't do exact approval voting, but essentially they did a form of approval voting where they had you vote either positive, neutral, or negative, and then they only ended up tallying the positives. So that was effectively approval voting. If you had a positive opinion of a candidate, they won. And ultimately, 62% approval went to Rebel Black Bear. So that is their new mascot. All right, some postscripts and some thoughts, both humorous and serious, about how to talk about this, this idea. Should chocolate chips switch parties? Similar to some candidates with the American party structure, chocolate chips not a good fit for either one. Is that a good thing? Does it serve the electorate well by being a compromise, or does it become irrelevant because it can't fit in? You hear this all the time. There's a sort of a derogatory set of abbreviations you'll hear sometimes about candidates, Dino and Rhino, that stand for either Democrat or Republican in name only. The idea that they run for one party but they don't really represent that party very well. Prior to going to becoming an independent, sometimes the former, or current senator from Connecticut, Joe Lieberman, former vice presidential candidate, was considered to be a dino because he didn't tend to follow most of the Democratic leadership techniques. And there's some questions about the current senator from Massachusetts that's running for re-election, Scott Brown, whether he's a rhino because in order to get elected, he can't really be a Republican in Massachusetts. Why wasn't chocolate chip cookie dough on the ballot? Some people are very upset about this. Well, to maintain some control of the election, there has to be a maximum number of candidates. I mean, at some point, I've got to cut it off. And chocolate chip cookie dough has the same identity crisis that chocolate chip has, maybe even worse. It doesn't fit either of the existing major parties. And this is a problem you run into in, elections, in the sense that somebody wants to get on the ballot, but they don't stand out enough. They're kind of in the middle. They end up having to stand out in an obvious way, which is both good and bad, to be on the ballot. Should questions of bias be brought against the elections director? Should mint chocolate chip recruit pistachio to form a green party? I mean, right now, green parties around the world are politically trendy.
Green party being environmental?
Yes, it's a pun here. Play on the idea. What would be the ramifications of having a third major party in different systems? I mean, in some systems it doesn't matter. In some systems it does. In the United States, it's just about impossible to have a third major party. In other systems, it's much more likely. And an issue is we go back to too many candidates. Would one of the other flavors need to be removed, and if so, who? And that, of course, would be controversial. And then finally, with it being a presidential year, should I have treated different classes as states and formed an electoral college? Okay? Reasonable consideration, but it adds more work because I have to make sure that that the results from each class is kept separate through the whole process. And you get into another thing here in the United States, is a little bit of political thought. We have what we consider to be a federalist system where each state is responsible for how it runs its elections, so long as it satisfies federal voting laws. Is it possible that some states might use one system and other states use another? Do we have the right to tell another state how their votes are counted? So that is both a mathematical issue, which one is the best system mathematically, but also a political issue of who gets to make the decision. And that's it. Questions? So I'll just go ahead and add, in honor, and I left my other two ice cream scoops. The other two ice cream scoops are in the math department.
I saw them too.
Okay.
I was going to bring them.
Okay. But anyway, so in honor of our winning candidates, before you leave today, we should have enough time. You may get a bowl, you may get a spoon, and you may dip your favorite candidate and have some ice cream.
Okay, let's take Professor Hartfield one more time.